Hey, everybody. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Matt Rich Podcast. Today, I have a very special guest, Dr. Raymond Moody. He is a best-selling author of the book Life After Life, and he is the man who coined the term near-death experience. So he has actually been studying near-death experiences for a major portion of his life, and today we're going to dive into the topic of life after life. How are you doing today, Dr. Moody?
Well, I'm doing great. Good to see you, Matt.
Good. Yeah, great to see you. How's the pandemic been treating you?
Well, my attitude, I understand people who are depressed about the pandemic, and but my attitude was that really what surprised me was that this took so long to come.
Mhm.
I've studied pandemics. I had obviously you have some epidemiology in medical school and so on, and I just always been interested in the topic historically.
Mm.
And so really when this started happening, I was surprised it's taken so long to occur.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I mean, I'm a hermit myself, so it hasn't got on my nerves staying at home. I like to be home, but at the same time, I do feel sympathy for all those people who are, distressed
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
this.
Yes. Crazy times, but it is nice that you could do a lot of your work in the comfort of your home as well.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of what led you into this work, studying the afterlife and near-death experiences.
Well, Matt, I'm 76 years old now, and what's really interesting to me about this is that what I'm known for um, is to me a sort of offshoot or corollary of my main interest since I was 7 or 8 years old.
Hmm.
And a big formative event in my life was I got interested in astronomy when I was 7 years old, and I built my first telescope at age 8.
Hmm.
And I also wanted to be a comedian at that time, and so so at the same time I was studying astronomy. I was My favorite authors were Lewis Carroll, Through the Looking Glass and Alice in Wonderland, and Dr. Seuss, who was a different author when I was a kid. The the Cat in the Hat was a letdown for me because my favorites were like Horton Hears a Who and all this stuff. Um, so in other words, I was just very interested in nonsense from the time I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And so um, looking through the telescope at age 8, I had an experience which I'm sure you've had. A lot of people have it when you reflect, is that you get to thinking, well, how big is this thing we're in?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so
Oh,
your
yeah.
mind goes out to the wall.
Mm-hmm.
But then you say, well, just a minute here, doesn't there have to be something on the other side of a wall?
Yeah.
And so you realize that the idea that it ends in a wall is nonsensical. But the other intuitive possibility seems to be it goes on forever and ever and ever, and that doesn't make any sense either.
Yeah.
And that wasn't troubling to me. As a matter of fact, it was delightful to me that because I was interested in nonsense, and I remember specifically intuitively putting those two things together.
Hmm.
That this world that we're in is nonsensical in the same sense that Horton Hears a Who and Alice in Wonderland. And so I carried this interest on through, and by the way, I never was religious. My dad was number one, a surgeon, if you know that personality, and number two, a professional military officer.
Hmm.
Put those two personalities together. And Dad was in World War II in the Pacific Theater, and so I put this together retrospectively. But the way it manifested in my life was that he was very sarcastic and hostile to religion when I was a kid. And so I just didn't, and that was part of the landscape to me. I never thought about it until later that reflecting, I realized, that generation didn't talk, but I gathered that he probably saw horrific things as a medic in World War II in the
Yeah.
Pacific Theater, and it probably soured him on religion, as I gathered, which was fine with me. I didn't have a religious life.
So what led you
So,
to finding what led you to getting into near-death experiences?
well, all those things came together with near-death experiences because I went to University of Virginia at age 18, intent on majoring in astronomy, but I'd gotten interested in philosophy in high school. And so took a philosophy 1 course, and really, I could show you on the page Plato's Republic just a couple of days after I entered college, where I got hooked and said, well, philosophy is what I'm going to do. And so immediately Plato sort of became my hero. And so at the end, the point of Plato's Republic, really, it all sort of culminates in a near-death experience. The whole dramatic action of this drama, as it is, comes up to the point of the story of a man who was believed dead on the battlefield. Well, I remember very clearly, to me at that age, I thought that the afterlife was a theme of cartoons. That was the only way I had exposed to it. You see the cartoons with the clouds and such. But the fact that Plato took this question of an afterlife seriously, it kind of rattled me. And I got to thinking about his argument, which really in his works generally, it comes out to be that if there is an afterlife, then that's the pivot of everything, right? All the other questions kind of turn around that.
Yeah.
And so I remember asking my professor, Professor Hammond, what this story was about. And he said these early Greek philosophers studied cases of people who were apparently dead and revived. And that was the first I'd ever known about this. Well, but as Professor Hammond pointed out, there were 2 different points of view on them. Some philosophers like Plato listened to this and he took it seriously as indicating an afterlife. Meanwhile, Democritus, who had just figured out by reasoning it out that the tabletop in front of you, which looks solid, actually has to be made up of little invisible tiny bits that are called atoms.
And that came from just philosophical thought, right? Like just the process
Yeah.
of philosophy, which is
It had
really fascinating.
It did. Yeah. It came from the joint realization that a line, there's an infinity of points on a line, right? But also that 2 things can contact. So there must be a little place there. So Democritus wrote about this too, but he said there's no such thing as a moment of death, and that what these experiences are all about is the residual biological activity in the body. So I was intrigued by this, and I've studied Plato since I was 18. And so, but it never occurred to me that that might be something that pertained to the modern world. But in 1965, I learned from one of my philosophy professors that Dr. George Ritchie, who at that time was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia Medical School. Sorry.
Okay.
I don't even have a car, but they keep calling me about my car.
Oh, don't you love those?
And so, sorry about
It's okay. I just had to mute mine too. I forgot mine too. So
Dr. Ritchie was very a generous person. Matter of fact, to this day, George Ritchie was the finest human being I ever knew. It just really, it was a remarkable thing. I heard him lecture on his experience. And at that point, I realized not that, that he was sincere. And that was a really great experience for me. I didn't know what it meant.
So he had a near-death experience himself.
He did.
And he was pretty credible.
Oh my God, yes. Like I said, the finest guy I ever knew in my life. And so I was impressed by Dr. Ritchie's story. And then when I got my PhD in philosophy, I started being a professor of philosophy, and I heard some of these same stories from my students and from my colleagues at the university where I was teaching. So that's how this got started. And then I went to medical school in 1972, which was an opportunity to talk with lots of critically ill patients, which
Yeah.
I did. Began to hear these things, and just subsequent to that time, heard thousands and thousands of these stories. And so
Wow.
that's how this got started. It has
Wow.
been a process where people ask me, well, do you believe that there's an afterlife? I have to say no, because, people frame this in terms of belief, but analytic philosophy was my thing. This thing that people say, I believe that, and like in religion, it's your inward beliefs that constitute your identity and so on. Well, my take on this is very, very different. Um, I think that the real difficulty has to do with intelligibility. You might have studied the analytic philosophers like A.J. Ayer and so on, who pointed out that even though in ordinary life we use this phrase, there's life after death, and it brings vivid images to our minds and maybe good feelings, and so we think there's some cognitive content to it. But when you really analyze it, it turns out to be nonsensical to say that there's an afterlife. It's a self-contradiction.
Hmm.
So that was my interest in it, but you see, I think, um, Matt, that I guess maybe my favorite of my discoveries in life has been I have discovered a collective cognitive flaw that's built into the architecture of the way we think about things.
Hmm.
And this has been my life's work, really. This was my doctoral dissertation in 1969, and I've continued to work on this. And what this cognitive flaw is all about is that in reality, people love nonsense,
Mhm.
right? Dr. Seuss's books have sold over 600 million copies.
Whoa. That's
Yeah.
crazy. Just from
You
rhyming,
think
huh?
about Dr. Seuss, Lewis Carroll,
Yeah.
his sort of perpetual. One that you may not have heard about is Edward Lear, who was an English nonsense poet at the same time of Lewis Carroll, and um, and you think of, you're too young to remember what we call doo-wop music, but this was big in the 30s and the
Hmm.
60s and 50s. And it consists of nonsense is the main line or harmony. And
Okay.
then it's mixed in with intelligible parts so that the combination of them just really puts you into a sort of conceptual spin.
So when you say
Uh,
nonsense, you're saying like just almost like gibberish, like things that just don't form
Language
correct
that
sentences.
doesn't make sense. That's right.
Yes.
And it's a big
Okay.
thing. You think of all the kids' playground rhymes,
Hmm.
and Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald and scat singing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, right. So nonsense is a big part of our lives, but people hate the word nonsense. So
Hmm.
what this proves, is as you think this out, is that there is a sort of a cognitive deficit that we all have, there we can't think logically about things that don't make sense.
Hmm.
And uh, and I'm a lover of Aristotle, by the way, so this is not meant to criticize Aristotle, but this was really fixed on us by Aristotle. Plato was the first person to distinguish between the literal and the figurative mode of discourse, right? And he connected the literal mode of language with the true false distinction, which is why we say the literal truth.
Mhm.
And figures of speech, for most part, Plato left those over with the drama department and the poets and all. um, but although he was a magnificent user of them himself.
Hmm.
But he was also, in one of his dialogues, he was also aware that there's a third framework of language, which is very important, the nonsensical. He wrote a whole dialogue on this, and he pointed out some things that are discoverable about nonsense. One is that nonsense makes people laugh.
Hmm.
You think Dr. Seuss. He pointed out that there's different types of nonsense.
Hmm.
Um, Listen to this. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. You recognize that as nonsense, but now listen to this. Holiness breeds the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity. That's nonsense too, but it's different from the first type, right?
Yeah.
Now listen to this type. That cannibal you men just ate was the last one in this county. That's nonsense too, but it's a different type. Or hat thoroughly the if zoom sow zest is yet another. Or beloved but you never get try to remember that.
Oh
I've
my.
cataloged and identified over 70 different types of nonsense.
It's
And
almost like another language.
well, it's another mode of language. And the really interesting discovery I've made over the years, Matt, which I think this is the most important thing that I have discovered, is that in the ordinary common sense world, if this is the level of ordinary meaningful language,
Hmm.
most people think of nonsense as something sublinguistic down
Hmm.
here. But if you think it through, actually, nonsense is a sort of something on the top of the level of ordinary meaningful language. It's a secondary development, and
Hmm.
and that it's very important. And science, for example, is a placeholder. Um, in science, well, for example, the example now would be the two most powerful explanatory systems ever developed in physics are the general theory of relativity and the quantum theory. The trouble is, if you integrate the two
Wow.
sets of equations, it's nonsense.
Oh, wow. I get it. So
Yeah.
it's like
So
it's
it's a
speculation in a
placeholder.
sense.
It's what
Yeah,
we hold on to in anticipating that eventually
it's
this
truth.
is going to be worked out. Now,
Wow.
it's also important in religion and the Christian group. They have what's called glossolalia, or speaking in unknown tongues, which is it's ecstatic utterance. They get started and it's nonsense syllables drawn from the speaker's own language, put together with no meaningful combinations and no grammar. And if you start this, you don't need to be in a religious ceremony, but if you just start doing it spontaneously, although you don't have to have an ecstatic state to begin it, eventually, after a few minutes, you will get into a really fascinating ecstatic state. Or in the Zen Buddhist traditions, the koans are often nonsense questions, right? What is the sound of one hand clapping? And the point of this is the student is put to work on the koan and tries to solve it logically, which eventually flips them over into a state of consciousness beyond logic. Or in advertising, I have a big collection of nonsensical advertisements I've
Yeah.
gathered over. The most famous recent one is that hotel commercial where the guy kept saying "bada book, bada boom," if you remember that one.
Yeah, I
And
was just
that
about to say
there,
mostly any commercials are nonsensical.
well, to a degree,
Yeah.
yeah, and um, so it has many implications. And what I, by the way, I'm not trying to sell a book. I mean, I just, I'm not a commercially minded person, but I want to show you this book. This is really my life's work. Um, it's published about a year ago by
Oh,
Llewellyn, and I would really love to see what you think about
I would
this.
love
It's
to read
called
it. Yes.
"Making Sense of Nonsense," but I've worked out a a system of logical principles for how you think about nonsense. Now, what in the world is he talking about? How does this relate to near death experiences? Well, one of the principles of nonsense that I've worked out is that one of the things is that there's different types of nonsense, as we already seen. And I've discovered that you can take any framework of language, And you can lay down a layer of nonsense over the top of it, and that will create the effect in the mind of that framework of language. Sounds so abstract, but let me give an example. When Abraham Lincoln was president, he was at a formal state ceremony. I forgot what it was, but it was very solemn, and everybody was gathered around the president, and his role in the ceremony called on him to mount a horse and to lead the procession away from the scene. So all these people gathered around solemnly, and Lincoln got up on the horse, but when he did, the horse put its own back hoof up and got it caught in the stirrup. So the horse was bouncing around. Everybody's so embarrassed. Oh, how embarrassing for the president. You know, it's like a thick silence. But Lincoln looked down to the horse and said, well, if you're getting on, I'm getting off. And so the crowd just dissolved into laughter. Right? Well, you think about that for a moment. That's nonsense. To say that a horse could get on its own back by putting a hoof in the saddle and climbing board is nonsensical. But you've got to admit that it creates a very powerful image in the mind of that very motion.
Yes, yes.
Now, again, what is he talking about? Well, what do people with near-death experiences tell us? They say, number one, there are no words for this. You know, that it's ineffable, that this state of consciousness is indescribable, beyond words. And they also say that it did not take place in time. Time stood still, and I saw everything I had ever done in my life, and no time passed. And they say it also does not occur in a spatial framework. They say it's no longer in space. So what do they tell us? Well, the best I can do is to say that I got out of my body. I went through a tunnel into a light. I met my deceased relatives. And I saw my life pass in review. I returned to my body and came back to life. That's a travel narrative, right?
Yes.
So what meaning does a travel narrative have when there's no time and space? So in 2021, stories of near-death experiences are unintelligible nonsense. But that worries some people, but not me. I think that's exactly how it should be. If somebody went to some other framework of existence and made a return trip back, the only way they would have to express it would be nonsense.
Nonsense,
right?
Yeah, completely.
You can see this if you think of the Escher drawings, right? The water goes down the trough, over the wheel, then down one trough, then down another trough, then down another trough, then down another trough. So it's back where it began.
Yes, like the illusions, yeah.
That's right. If you took a ruler and a protractor and what graphic artists called a value scale with all the shades from the brightest white to the darkest black, you could make it through a meaningful, intelligible description of that surface. This line is 17 inches long and it goes off from this line at a 43-degree angle. You could do that and it would be intelligible. But when you try to describe what's in the picture, you get into nonsense. The water goes up, 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 or down, 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 and it's the same place.
Yeah.
So that shows that when the mind switches from one framework of existence to some other framework, it necessarily generates nonsense. Right? Now, so nonsense is not a fixed quantity. Unintelligibility is not a fixed quantity. Go back in your mind to 1915 and assume the persona of a well-educated, informed person of the year 1915.
Okay.
And listen to the following sentences. Sentence number one. All four of Ethel's grandparents perished and were lost in a shipwreck long before her mother and father were born. That's unintelligible
Hmm.
in 1915. Now add the knowledge, the role of DNA in genetics, the idea of cloning, of gene editing, of gene splicing. And now, although it has not happened, it's intelligible because
Mhm.
we can imagine sending a probe down to the bones and getting the DNA and drawing it and doing clone. Okay,
Yeah.
intelligible.
Yeah.
Or go back to 1915 and listen to the following sentence. Two women got married to each other at City Hall yesterday. Unintelligible in 1915,
Yeah. Yeah.
intelligible today. Or 1915, I watched a movie on my phone this morning, unintelligible. So what I'm getting at is that the fact that something is unintelligible and at point X doesn't mean that it will be unintelligible at point Y.
Yeah.
So that's what my current research on near-death experiences is. I've been doing this. I've did a whole semester-length course on nonsense gradually since 1969. I've been building this up. I've taught this course at many universities. The CIA has gotten interested in it, and I tell you, and I'm
Wow.
saying that because it's really interesting. Before I met the CIA, I thought, my knowledge was James Bond movies, right? But that they heard about my work through a friend of theirs who had worked with them for a while. And so years ago, my wife kept getting these really unusual communications from back in up in North Carolina. We knew it was not West Virginia. We knew it was not the regular kind of folks who invited me. But it's very mysterious. So I ended up there in West Virginia with the CIA, and
Wow.
and I gotta say, and the reason I'm saying this, Matt, I hate it that these wonderful folks are getting, what the moron in charge a few months ago did to them is just
Mhm.
tremendous, because you would love these guys. It's like, don't think James Bond, think like, the hair, the shirt tail out. As Kant says in his critique of pure reason, every one of them so darn nice.
Really?
I mean, just completely lovable. You
Wow.
got to think, what they can only get those jobs by being squeaky clean, right? They
Yeah.
all got to be super nice. So they've had me back a couple of times since then.
Cool.
And you don't know what they're very circumspect, but the fact that they've had me back twice on this thing from their original time, gives me encouragement, because I think that these very brilliant people realize there's something to this.
Yes.
And so eventually I realized a long time ago that eventually somebody who has been through my course and has learned how to think about nonsensical things in a logical way
Mhm.
is going to happen to have a near-death experience. And for reasons that I lay out in the book, but which would be a little too hard to squeeze into this period of time, somebody who has a near-death experience in a subsequent to having these principles of nonsense and unintelligibility in their mind would be forced to articulate it in a new way.
Hmm.
I won't go into the reason, but you would understand if I laid it
Yes.
out.
Yeah.
And so it's already happened that this wonderful man who's a distinguished artist and
Hmm.
scientist took one of my courses. And then several years later, he developed H1N1 and was in the hospital for 60 days and 3 cardiac arrests and
Wow.
a terrible situation. But he called me shortly after the ordeal, and his voice was very weak, and he was describing the near-death experience to me. But he said, his voice suddenly got energetic, and he said, "And Raymond, while I was over there, my mind went back to the nonsense seminar." And he said, "And I realized that what you're saying is true." He said that you can't comprehend how that world is connected to this world unless you take the unintelligibility axis into account. So I claim, when I'm not trying to pat myself on the back or to state a new belief system, but just to make a challenge, that I claim that there is a kind of breakthrough now in how you investigate rational, investigate question of life after death rationally. And what this means is, if you ever thought about it, people say all the time, well, it's 4.3 light years out to Alpha Centauri. Well, I guess very few people have ever stopped to think, well, how do they know that? I mean, you can't send a homing pigeon out there with an odometer on its leg. How did they figure this one out? Well, it has to do with what's called parallax. By the 19th century, they had realized that. From the Newtonian mechanics, they understood that there's 180 million miles across the orbit of the Earth around the sun. 186 million miles to be exact. And so when the Earth was here in its orbit, they would measure carefully the angles to some apparently nearby stars that seemed very bright. Waited exactly 6 months later till they measured the angle to the same stars very carefully. So you'd realize there'd be a little difference, right, from your high school trigonometry. So that's the way they initially calculated out to how close it is to Alpha Centauri. Now, being a good compulsive and, never wanting to make a mistake, I can immediately go on to say that this technique of parallax only works out to about, I think it's 10 parsecs, which is 30-something light years. Beyond that, you have to use a different measure, which is called Cepheid variance. And I'm not going to go into that, but what I'm saying is the stars that are relatively up close, you can calculate their distance by this parallax method. Well, what I've come up with is a similar analogous technique for dealing with the afterlife, because we already have abundant cases of near-death experiences that are articulated through the lens of Aristotelian literal logic, which makes them a travel narrative. But now we see why that doesn't make intelligible sense. But in the not too distant future, we will have other accounts of near-death experiences visualized not just through the Aristotelian literal logic, but also through these additional principles of how the unintelligible, meaningless language works. And so that will give parallax. So this is, I think, a brand new way of thinking about how to investigate the afterlife. I am not a parapsychologist, by the way, I think. And these are my dear friends. This is not a personal criticism in any way, but anybody, I think, who tells you that, they got scientific evidence or scientific proof of an afterlife, that's just not correct. Because the question is, there is no agreed upon way to confirm or to disconfirm it, right? That's difficult. David Hume was one of my favorite. He's my favorite 18th century philosopher.
The skeptic.
Yep. And Hume said, he was asked about the question, and he said this, and if you'll follow the words through as I say them, you'll see he's absolutely right. He said, by the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. Now, that's an understatement. And he went on to say, some new species of logic is requisite for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. Well, he was being ironical. What he meant to say was that it's impossible.
Yeah.
Right? Because the idea that we could just come up with some new logic, Aristotle's worked very well for us for 2,300 years. And at least we think we know where our minds, well, as a psychiatrist, and you probably on your own grounds, realize that we don't know our minds very well, but most people think they do, right? So the idea that we could stumble across some new faculty that would give us insight on this problem, that, in my opinion, is just not in the works. Or in most people's opinion, is not in the works. Well, what I want to say right now, and I'm happy to defend these claims, I'm not saying this to make an ideological pronouncement. I'm making this pronouncement to say challenge people, and let's think through this together.
Yeah.
Because I say that I've solved Hume's problem, that the additional logic we need is a logic of nonsense, which is
Yes.
perfectly possible. Is you can't think logically about things that don't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
If you
And
use
apply
these new
philosophy
principles.
and logic to that
Yes, yes.
that statement or
And as
problem.
I've learned in my classes that I've taught about this for decades, I have exercises in connection with this class where the students they have to, they learn a pattern of a certain type of nonsense. Then they will have to write their own examples of it by the pattern. Then they will have to introspect, how did that make me feel and all. And so in doing
Hmm.
these exercises, my students have reported, this is consistently over decades, people say that when they shift from creating original examples of one type of nonsense to shift to creating original examples of some other types of nonsense, they feel mental processes that they're at work in their minds that they've never experienced before.
Wow.
And so this has had all kinds of effects on my students, not, people who ended up in advertising or art or psychology, or it's just all kinds of fields. People have applied these principles to their own bailiwick.
Whether they know it
But
or not, they're doing it.
well, they do. I mean, it becomes conscious. People do say that this makes a big impact on their mind. Artists say that it opens up creative channels they didn't know they
Interesting.
had. Yeah, yeah. And
Interesting.
medical doctors too. I had already been doing this when I went to medical school, Matt. And I had been classifying these different types of nonsense. So when I got on the wards as a medical student, actually dealing with patients, very quickly became aware that people with different kinds of medical diagnoses talk nonsense. For example, people who are delirious,
Mm-hmm.
if you listen to it's nonsensical. Or people who were intoxicated with mercury, for example,
Hmm.
will talk nonsense. Or people who are in severe stress, not that they are injured in a wreck or whatever, but that they come into the ER with somebody who was injured. And when you try to get a story as to what happened out of the uninjured person, it's just gibberish,
Hmm.
right? So it's stress, it's in schizophrenia. Schizophrenics use neologisms, made up, meaningless words. And so what I realized that when patients talk nonsense involuntarily because of some medical condition, they talk identically the same types of nonsense that Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll and others write
Whoa.
deliberately.
Whoa.
So what that means is nonsense is nonsense, whether it's deliberate or involuntary.
Wow. And what you're
And
trying to do is develop or teach people the tools to develop their sense of logic in a way where
yeah,
it makes nonsense or experiences of nonsense more decipherable and understandable.
absolutely.
You're
And you
trying to
can
give people the
actually then
tools.
do things with them.
Yeah, that's how you train these afterlife survivors to come back with more information, because you
That's
train
right.
them to think about those situations logically. It's almost like you're preparing everybody to, just in case they have an ND, a near-death experience, um, to kind of prepare for it and what to expect or
That's
how to
right.
come back with
I'm
information.
conducting a sort of collective study.
Yeah.
It's this book, and again, I just hate to do this because I'm not a salesman, right?
Plug it in. Who cares?
But okay, good. But please read this. This
Yeah,
is, what this does
I will.
is that this it has exercises in there where you can actually reformat your mind to think logically about nonsense, and
Hmm.
it sheds lights on all kinds of different fields, not just the afterlife.
Yeah, I feel like it would affect you in so many other ways, just approaching anything that's even
That's right.
nonsensical. Or yeah, that's a
When
cool.
I taught this course at University of Nevada at Las Vegas for 4 years, a lot of attorneys attended it.
Hmm.
And what their idea was that they say that that they are always looking for something to increase their critical thinking
Yeah.
skills. So
Yeah.
there was a lot, or there were English professors who would come, or
Yeah.
people interested in literature and so on, and kids who were interested in advertising. And it was just a whole bunch of folks. And so, I mean, it's just something that one of those things that, due to the wonderful person Aristotle, who just, he couldn't face this. Aristotle's favorite term for nonsense was random talk.
Hmm.
Well, we just showed that far from being random talk, nonsense is less random than
Yeah.
ordinary meaningful language. And the reason is very interesting. If I give you a sentence of ordinary meaningful language, all I have to do is to for you to comprehend it is I explain the meaning rules, like the rules that follows, right?
Hmm.
But if I explain a sentence of nonsense, then I have to explain not only the rules it follows, but also the rules it breaks. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. That's nonsense. But you notice that nonetheless, it's English grammar,
Mm-hmm.
isn't it?
Yeah.
'Twas brillig and the slithy toves. So much so that even though it's nonsense, you can figure out that slithy is an adjective,
Yeah.
that toves is a noun.
Yeah.
Okay? But it violates, so it respects the grammatical rules of English, but it violates the basic convention that when you talk, you use words that have a lexical meaning,
Yeah.
right? That is,
Yeah.
you can look them up in the dictionary, and it
Mm-hmm.
violates that rule.
Yeah.
But it follows the rules of word formation, phonetical rules of word formation in English. So much does slithy and toves, do they sound like Portuguese words or Polish words or Russian words?
It sounds
No,
no, it
they
sounds
sound
English.
like English.
Yeah, it sounds
That's
English.
right.
And it's almost like I can't understand it, but it's like my brain is trying to. It feels like my brain is trying to grasp like hold on to something slippery and it can't grab it.
All my
Like it's
students say that.
yeah.
Alice in Wonderland said she heard the Jabberwocky poem, and she said, "Well, it's very pretty." And she said, "And it seems to fill my head with ideas, only I don't know what they are."
Yeah.
And Plato had observed that too, that even though it's meaningless,
Wow.
it creates this stream of mentation in your mind.
Wow.
Now, so you see that this particular type of nonsense, which I call near English, it obeys the grammatical rules. It disobeys the rules of using only words with a lexical meaning, but it follows the rules of phonetic rules of word formation in English. Each type of nonsense breaks some rules and violates others so that the outcome is unintelligible.
Hmm.
So that is why nonsense is a more complex structure of language
Yeah.
and less random than ordinary meaningful language. And there's also these amazing things I've discovered. I mean, just back because I've been working on this since I was a kid. One I discovered was that if you rehearse, you got to do this with zangs, right? You can't be hesitant on this, and you got to really get into it. But what you do, if you just just memorize a bunch of nonsense, right? And so that you can speak it fluently. And then you go to a group or you to talking to somebody, and you just lapse into talking nonsense, right? But without any indication to them that you're up to it. See, you just do it naturally. And what it does, man, is that it creates this automatic mechanism where they talk nonsense back to you, but they're not conscious that they're doing it. It's really
Whoa.
startling. Matter of fact, one of the naval intelligence officers who came down to talk to me about this, and I was telling him about this, and then a few days later, we got this urgent communication from him. Said, my colleagues and I we were able to replicate your result just by walking into the local Starbucks.
Wow. Wow.
There's a lot of stuff here that is people have missed because of this nonsense taboo, right? They
Yeah.
don't like the word.
Yeah.
So that just blocks off this whole other dimension of language and thinking from their minds. So
Yeah.
it's like they're walking around in a daze.
Yeah. And we just kind of push that part of us away, or that thinking away, thinking it's not logical. But when we
Mm-hmm.
apply logic to it, it
That's
actually
right.
is, it's this thing we all do, but no one has really paid attention to it besides, you,
Exactly.
and which is really crazy.
Because of this authority of Aristotle. You think back in high school, you learned about, because his authority was so severe that, people just didn't, then the history of science has been partly like Galileo saying, well, maybe the two balls of unequal weight don't go down at the
Hmm.
same,
So now,
at different rates.
when when I think of near death experiences, it makes me think that a lot of cultures and religions were kind of formed on this idea of an afterlife. A
Mhm.
lot of religions were inspired by it. And when you think back to what you said about Aristotle kind of changing the way we think about nonsense, is that why we're so far away from what, like, why were our ancient ancestors obsessed with the concept of the afterlife and we have forgotten about it? And is it because we don't think that way anymore? Were our ancestors thinking in that way of nonsense? Do they embrace that idea more, and that idea of, like, you know,
Well, my own take on this, I've studied Greek philosophy assiduously since I was 18 years old. That's just in the last, I was just having to count since we just moved here recently. And I put all my books on the shelf. In order, I just realized that just since I've been here in September, I've read 6 books on ancient
wow.
Greek philosophy. And that's how it's been all of my life,
Hmm.
right? And so, um, and here I am. There's still far, 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 far more about ancient Greek philosophy than I don't know
Yeah.
than
Yeah.
I do, right? But from my take on it, um, I think the shift is just about the same. It's just like some people in every era have scoffed. It was the same in the ancient world. Some people just say, "Oh, that's ridiculous," and other people took it seriously.
Hmm.
And so that I don't think that's changed that much, and it's still a very big question for many people.
Yeah.
And I will just tell you the truth. You ask about belief. I can't say that I believe that there's life after death, because that's not the right word to use to it.
Hmm.
Because it's this idea of belief that exists in common language is kind of an illusion. Because what people think, when I believe that such and such, they think they're reporting on some internal state. But the way I look at it, I think that belief is one of a long series of similar locutions. I know that such and such. I believe that such and such. I suspect that such and such.
Hmm.
I guess that such and such. I assume that such and such. There's a couple of dozen of them. And those words, they are not designed to report on some inner state.
Hmm.
What they are designed to do is to convey to your hearer what degree of confidence they can place on what follows the that
Oh,
based on your say so. So if you say, I know that, you kind of guarantee, right?
yeah.
And you sort of imply that you have some rational reason that you could show them.
Hmm.
But if you say, I believe that, you mollify it a little bit.
Yeah.
If you say, I suggest, I guess, I assume,
It
I
goes down and down.
conjecture, you just come down. And so but why do we pick out that one to be so, people say, oh, God's going to send you to hell if you don't believe in the Trinity or whatever. I mean, that's just ridiculous. That's an attempt at human control. So I don't think in terms of belief. But where I will honestly admit to you, Matt, is that I've just reached the point where I give up. I feel like I've been boxed into a corner. And although I wouldn't want to characterize it as belief, I have to stutter out, to my astonishment, there is an afterlife. I wouldn't ever try to convince anybody else of that,
Mhm.
but I just give up. You know, it's like the standard objection to these near-death experiences, which I didn't fall for even in my early career, is, oh, this is oxygen deprivation to the brain, right?
Why do
Well,
you
my
not think
first,
that?
well, because in the first couple of, well, number one, on philosophical grounds, because the mind-body relationship is a mystery. We don't know how that works.
Hmm.
But the people who make this a matter of the oxygen deprivation, their theory is called epiphenomenalism, which is that there is no independent reality to consciousness, that it's the secondary illusory byproduct of the primary
Hmm.
reality, which is the brain substances and the electrochemical reactions. But how in the name of God do you prove that?
Yeah.
There's lots of other, yeah, my intuitive thing is more on the side of the what idealist, not in the sense of the vernacular of the person with elevated ideals, but in the sense that the George Berkeley, for example, the philosopher who said that what exists is minds and ideas and minds.
Hmm.
And I learned that very early when I was a kid. I was fully aware that I was conscious. That's self-certifying. But to go on from there and to say that there's an external physical world, that's just a matter of inference from recurrent patterns in your experience, right? So I mean, I haven't been able to make that break yet. I can conceive of all sorts of other ways that it might be put together. But then the other reason is that it's very common for people at the bedside of the dying who are not themselves ill or injured will nonetheless have this whole thing. They say, I got out of my body and I went part way toward this light with grandma, or I saw
People who are
apparitions.
next to, so people who aren't sick, who are laying next to someone dying, has a near death experience with that person.
It's very common. I think it's
Whoa.
probably they are more common than even near-death experiences. The reason being that the average fate of somebody who is resuscitated is they die, right? Whereas the bystanders live. And all the things that we know of as near-death experiences are reported by bystanders who are not ill or injured at the bedside,
Wow.
including, and this is the one that's most shocking to me. This is the most shocking thing I know about near-death experiences,
Hmm.
is that it occurs that the somebody at the bedside will empathically co-live the dying life review of the person who is passing
Whoa.
away. The first cases I had over the years were people who were intimate with the person, like a, a wife in one case, or a mother, two mothers who had
Hmm.
that reviewed the lives of their kid, dying teenage boy.
Wow.
But then subsequently, some years ago, a physician got in touch with us was an ER physician who was called to the ER to resuscitate a patient he had never laid eyes on. And he was saying that as this guy was passing away, he said he was just surrounded by this hologram of this guy's life.
Wow.
So something else is going on than oxygen deprivation to the brain. I learned this very early in medical school because I was already had a name for investigating NDEs when I started to medical school, and the faculty knew about it. And one of my own medical school professors told me about how she had this experience when she was unsuccessfully trying to resuscitate her own mother. But that doesn't mean that this oxygen deprivation account is going to go away, because it's there's an entertainment value to this. It's
Hmm.
like there's a certain kind of person who just enjoys debating about this. And that's the familiar debate form that they are into. And also it's part of their metaphysics, I guess. I mean, it's, uh, people just get fixed on this idea of the brain. I had a wonderful friend who in graduate school who went into neurophysics and neurosciences, and he and I used to sit in Charlottesville at lunch and debate about this. And I was saying, I think this is some wrinkle in consciousness is not going to be I don't see that it could be executable by brain things. And David would say, oh no, in a few years we'll have it all figured out with the neurons and all. I don't think so. But then 30 years later, he called me from his university, invited me to come and talk on near-death experiences. And when I got off the plane, he looked at me and he said, well, Raymond, you were right. And that often happens with people in the neurosciences. They start out early with this optimism that the riddle of consciousness is about to be cracked. And then as they age, I've seen this happen with a lot of them, that eventually they get around to the philosophical position that there's something that's not crackable by the way that we.
That's interesting. It's like it's like the brain trying to study itself, and it reaches these paradoxes where it can't really reach beyond a point of non-exist, or imagining what it would be like if it didn't exist. And even I think the philosopher Lucretius was the one who was saying that the soul cannot exist outside of the body, or the consciousness doesn't exist outside of the body. But the argument, as you just put it, the more you go into neuroscience, the more you find out that the less you know about really where the consciousness is being created. Yeah. And then
and the philosophical problems aren't any different from what they were a couple of hundred years ago.
Exactly. So the debate is still the same. Like, is consciousness a byproduct of our brain and body, or is consciousness something that our brain and body is the receiver of? And so, that is where all this.
Or another one, even beyond that, Matt, is the brain a projection of consciousness? You see, is it like the illusion of the backstory? You're no doubt, familiar with the problem of personal identity in philosophy, right? Where it started with, I guess the big hallmark development was Plato articulating the notion that our personal identity consists of our immaterial soul, right? And that the bearer of immortality, whereas the body is a changing, shifting thing with no reality. And then I guess you could have been executed in the Middle Ages for refusing to believe that. But then when Hobbes came along, for example, the idea, he specifically said the whole notion of an immaterial substance is nonsense. But then John Locke tried to fix it a few generations later by saying, well, what constitutes our personal identity is our memories.
Mm-hmm.
But then in the next phase of it, Hume said, when I look within myself to see what is most intimately I call myself, he said, I never stumble across any underlying thing. It's always just the passing impressions of the moment. Right? Well, I have a very different take on it. I say that your personal identity consists of your story. What is your personal identity but your life story? And so even your consciousness, Matt, if you think about it, is geared to a narrative. It's a narrative consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. When any new thing happens to you, what happens is your mind adds that event into your ongoing life story. Elie Wiesel said, I don't know if you know him, Elie Wiesel, you should look at him. He's a little before your time, but he had been to Auschwitz and survived. And after the war, he came as a very lovely, heartfelt, deep, reflective man who wrote a lot of great books. I think he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, as I recall, sometime in the 60s. faculties. And in one of Elie Wiesel's books, he says, God made man because he loves stories.
Mm.
There's something in the cinematography business, the Kulnikov effect. I'm not sure I remember the name right, but Kulnikov or something like that effect, where scientists have discovered that when you present any two random images to the human mind in sequence, the mind starts spinning a story between those two images.
Huh.
So our consciousness is narrative based.
Yeah.
So I had that same back in a long time ago, since I had gone through a PhD program in philosophy and I had taught philosophy for 3 years. I was older than the other psychiatry residents in my program, right? Because medical school came later. Plus, I was known in the community for writing this book.
Mm-hmm.
So usually most institutions have a place where, the chief of police and the mayor and the city council people and all the celebrities in town, they can't come to the front door of the mental health clinic like the rest of us peons,
Mm-hmm.
right? They have to have a mechanism for getting in the back door. Okay, so I was elected. So for a year, I had this really wonderful experience of sitting there and talking with very elderly, very distinguished, very reflective, very accomplished people in the community who were there for mostly situational stress or, just loneliness. As I quickly realized, a lot of them just wanted somebody to talk to. And so repeatedly from these reflective people during that time, I heard the same comment. They said, Raymond, as I look back on my life, I develop just more and more, I'm developing this uncanny sense or impression that this has all been like a story or a script or a play or a movie.
Mm-hmm.
They would use different words. And so at one, I was wondering, well, is this just a folk belief in this region? I mean, it's this some people say. But then as I traveled to Europe and in different parts of the world, I heard that same thing from old people. I heard it from
that their life felt like a movie or a play or something.
Yeah. That the older you get. And Joseph Campbell said it on one of his tapes one time. So that's what I think. And then of course, now, as a logician, I immediately say here, just a minute. What Raymond Moody is doing is he's taking one aspect of human life, namely the theater, and he's projecting it out as a model of the whole. And that's a logical fallacy. Matter of fact, it was one of the original logical fallacies that Aristotle set out in his book on it. It's like taking a metaphor and literalizing it. And I see that argument. But in fact, I say that it happened the other way around. That the reason we have the theater is that old people realize the older they get that their life has been a story. And you can look at the history of the theater and see this. It was about 600 or so in Athens, and they had this harvest festival, which was traditional, where there would be a chorus who would sing these stories. But then on this one occasion, for reasons unknown, this one guy, Thespis, stepped forward and he spoke his own lines, and it created a sensation. Well, what were the Greeks all about? Think about it. One of the big things in their culture, which we don't really think about it because we inherited it from them, is competition. Right? The Olympics. Competition was the name of the game. So Pisistratus, who was the tyrant of Athens at that time, said, let's have a contest, right? To see who can do the best of these. First
Wow.
winner, Aeschylus. Then it goes on. Second big winner, Sophocles. Third big winner, Euripides. It took 50 years for this to become a profession.
Wow.
Now, what I'm getting at is the template that created the theater was this very thing that is in people's minds, that the older they get, the more when they look back at it, they see the dramatic structure. And that's how and originally the theaters were temples to gods and goddesses. And so what some scholars wonder, how in the world did they get people to sit still for that long? At the Olympics, they were jumping up and down. How can they sit for hours and watch this stuff? Well, because it's built into us, right?
Wow.
So that's what I think life is story, that, and that I think this thing we're living in is kind of the theater. A few years ago, I was talking about these ideas down in a Hindu ashram, and when my lecture was over, the Swami came forward and he said, "Yeah, this is what we figured out too." He said, "That's what we think is that they call it the veil of illusion or something. They say that these are stories or lives, and that this is a kind of theater." And as psychotic as that sounds, and I realize it sounds psychotic, but nonetheless, at a certain point, it makes a certain amount of sense. How do you figure out this thing we're in?
Yeah. So what would you say from that conclusion that what is the meaning of life? Do you think, to you, what is the meaning of life? Or to these people who have experienced near-death experiences, what do they come back and like how do they even come back to this reality if they experience something beyond this one? Like, why would they want to come
Well,
back? How
number
do they
one, it
handle it?
really creates it's a homesickness phenomenon,
Wow.
for want of a better term. I
Wow.
hear this all the time. It's very difficult to
Homesick.
people. You might remember in Plato's cave allegory, they're living down in this shadow theater that they don't realize there's
Yes.
shadows on walls. But what if one of them was unloosened from the manacles and brought up? And, then when they were forced, if they went back down there, they wouldn't be very good at explaining to other people
Yeah.
what they had been through. And so, and if I say that this is story, life is story, and that is what our personal identity is. And that also, I am not a parapsychologist, as I mentioned to you before, and I've known this guy who was famous parapsychologist who studied reincarnation. His name was Ian Stevenson, and I loved Ian dearly. But I used to, and none of this is behind his back. I used to say to him, I said, Ian, you don't have any ability to critical think. I mean, this is just how a philosopher talks, as you mean. It wasn't anything hostile, but his idea of scholarship was that if you got the footnotes right, everything is okay, right? But he didn't. If you told Ian something that went along with his previous beliefs, he would accept it. But he was really very hot, just enabled to go beyond his own little presupposition. So I have some very severe doubts and
some people like that.
difficulties with Ian Stevenson on reincarnation. But what, honest to goodness, brought me around to this, Matt, although I don't know I want to use the word reincarnation. I have two wonderful kids. Carter, you saw earlier. Carter was he is 22 now. He's Mexican American by heritage. We adopted him from Kerrville, Texas. At the moment of birth, the obstetrician just delivered him and
Oh,
handed him to my wife. Then we have Carol Ann, who's 20 now, and she's a Native American Blackfeet Indian. Same deal. We had her from the moment of birth. And also, my wife and I don't go to religious things, and we don't talk to the kids about life after death. We talk to the kids about what's for dinner, like what's at the movies this weekend, the homework. And so these kids found out about my work life after life by looking me up on the internet.
oh yeah.
Okay. So both of them, just out of nowhere, at a fairly early age, started relating where they were before. And it's a long story, but I mean, I'm now the hair going up on my arms just thinking about this years later. For example, Carter, when he was 5 years old, he and I lying on bed watching TV, and I was flipping through the channels. And so I flipped through what turned out to be the National Geographic channel. But when I did, Carter became very animated. And he said, Dad, that's my village. What? And so I flipped back, and it was a National Geographic thing about village life in China. And Carter just started chattering. He said, yeah. He said, before I came to you and Mom, I lived with my other mommy and daddy in China and my brothers and sisters. And it made sense too. And he still eats Chinese food. I mean, this is just so, there's a lot to this, the other things. But this was so shocking and surprising to me that it put me into a state of speechlessness, which was a good thing. I'm glad I didn't ask him any further questions. But he was just, he was so animated. And so when he saw that I was incomprehending, he said, yeah. And then I was up in the trees looking at you and Mommy lying in the grass.
What?
And I knew exactly what he was talking about because before he was born, my wife and I went to Greece. And we were at this archaeological site, and we'd just gotten off the plane, and we were exhausted. And this place was way out in the middle of nowhere. So the attendant looked at us, and he could tell we were tired. He said, just go over there and lie down in the grass and take a nap. So we were lying in the grass with these big trees all around. And we were talking about adopting a baby.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Now, with Carol Ann, I have two grown sons who are on their own. Avery is a medical doctor in a prison, not serving his sentence, but serving the inmates. And Sam is a professor of Spanish linguistics now. Okay, but they're grown. But when they were kids, we had them, and I loved my sons, and I had always wanted a daughter. But my wife had difficulty with her last pregnancy. So we figured it's probably not very good for her to be having another baby. And so this one night I was sitting on my porch swing in Charlottesville. It was in the spring of 81 or 82. And Matt, it was a daydream, but a very heartfelt daydream came of, wouldn't it be wonderful to adopt a Native American daughter? And where it came from, I don't know, but I just dwelled on it that night. And so, but then I let it go because, there are technicalities with it. It's a hard thing to accomplish. And so I just didn't put any more thought into it. Then now flash forward, that was 81 or 82, flash forward 19 years later. Back in 1996, I was giving a lecture out in New Mexico, and I was sitting in the audience for the previous lecture,
Mm-hmm.
for my lecture. And so the previous lecturer finished his lecture and opened it up for questions. But it was one of these places to ask your question. You had to line up and to go to a microphone in the middle of the aisle and
Yeah.
ask a question. So my wife was sitting to my left, and to my right was sitting this Native American woman. I didn't know her or anything. Sitting, and both Cheryl and I realized that her body language, she wanted so much to ask her question, but I guess, partly I know Native American friends of mine, it's a different culture, it's I know when I lectured in the hospital at the Blackfeet Reservation, people would not want to make eye contact, right? It's just a cultural thing. So
Mm-hmm.
this woman whose name we found out was Christine, um, so my wife just tapped me, and I just naturally took my Christine by her arm, and I led her around and led her to the microphone and let her ask her question. Now that was in 1996 or so. So now flash forward, we adopted Carter in July of 1998. Then 2 years later in 2000, out of nowhere, Christine called me. We were living in Las Vegas at that time. Picked up the phone. It was Christine. Remember her cheerful voice? She said, "Oh, how are you doing?" And I said, "Well, we're doing great. We adopted a baby." And she said, "Oh, I wish so much I had known you were looking." And she said, "Because I work in the hospital on the reservation, and I'm the first person in the hospital who hears when we find a situation where we need adoptive parents." So I said, "Well, by all means." And so a couple of months later, she called and she said, "Well, your daughter is on her way."
Wow.
Now, by the way, it was really interesting raising a Native American daughter. She's 20 now, but Carol Ann is very wonderful with reading. And at age, we don't know how she learned to read. She just picked it up.
Hmm.
And so she just came in to me one day at age 6 and she said, "Daddy, I can read." And so um, when she was about 6, she started reading all these books on Pocahontas.
Hmm.
And then one day she looked at me and Cheryl just like this. And she said, "Were your people English?" And we said, "Well, yeah." And then she said, "Your people hurt my people."
No.
There's a lot of emotions with this. So when Carol Ann and I were 9, we went on these long walks every day, and she carried what she called her nature bag, collecting birds' eggs and such, which I think probably, her people were gatherers for 20,000 years. So on this one day, she was 9 years old, and there was an old wooden bridge about a mile from where we lived, and she loved to sit on that bridge and talk. And this one day, out of nowhere, she said, "I don't like this place," plainly referring to the world. And again, I'm shocked.
Hmm.
She said, "Yeah," she said, "when you die, you just go up and you be with God, and He holds you up there till all the people you know while you're alive have died. And then He sends you back as another person." And I said, "Well, what makes you say that?" And she said, "I just know in my mind." And she said, "And I was with Gotti, and He pointed you out to me. And He said, you got to go down to be His daughter." And I said, "Well, how did you feel about that?" And she said, "Oh, I didn't want to do it." She said, "I wanted to stay with my Gotti." But she said, "He pushed me," just doing like this twice. "He pushed me down to be your daughter."
Whoa.
So I said, well, are you glad you came anyway? And she said, oh, yeah, yeah. So
Wow.
where I'm going with this, Matt, is that although I don't want to use the reincarnation image, the way I'm sort of sensing this works is we go through one story here, and then we die and we go through some sort of incomprehensible process. And then we're back on another storyline. And what the whole thing means, I give up. There's been various, Plato talked about the great cycles. You do all these innumerable lives, and then you hop
Wow.
over into some other heightened state of existence. I mean, I just don't know.
That makes me think of it. It takes my brain in so many different directions when it comes to, if you want to think of modern terms of simulation, that we're just a
Mhm.
simulation playing over, or
Right.
if maybe consciousness has evolved because the universe has been around for so long. We're very, young as a species, but there could have easily been some sort of other intelligence that has developed in the universe that has gotten to some sort of what we would perceive as a godlike level. And, maybe that's something that we're kind of wrapped up in, like consciousness, um, giving itself stories to better
Yeah.
understand the universe and perspectives and all these things. And if that even makes sense, but I guess
Yeah. Well, it does and it doesn't. I
yeah,
mean, it may not make sense now, but in the future it may. And
yeah,
and also, I guess if you have a mind who's thought about these things, they certainly seem. For example, you asked earlier about how am I handling the pandemic,
hmm,
and a lot of people are going through a terrible thing about the pandemic. But um, the analogy I often use is I say, imagine that you were developed a terrible infection that required you be isolated by yourself, all by yourself on a desert island for 10 years. And they could send you out there in a cargo plane with room for all the food and water and medicine you're going to need for 10 years. And there was extra space in the cargo hold where they could send a DVD player and let's say 10,000 DVDs. And so, what I would ask you is, would you choose all comedies?
no,
No.
mm-mm.
And out of the thousands of people I've asked that, only 3 people said yes. And how they're staying in this world, I don't know. They very happily said yes.
Yeah,
But then I would ask you, would you choose some tragedies too? And you'd say, well, yeah. And then I ask you, well, when you're on that desert island all by yourself watching a tragedy, would you be crying? And of course you would, because that's the experience of a tragedy, right?
hmm,
So that's my best estimate as what the structure of this thing is like.
wow.
There is some other state of existence, and then we pop into this one, we emerge into this one. Plato said that when you come from that one to this one, that you go through what's called an event boundary, which is something you've experienced all the time, but it's a psychological concept. Like, imagine you're in your living room and you think you decide you want to go get something in the kitchen, right? And as soon as you walk through the door of the kitchen, you forget what you came in there for, right?
Hmm.
Plato said it's like that, and it's so that we won't be so confused. He says it's like we're wearing. He said he compares us to a horse with blinders,
Ah,
so that you can focus on the action at hand. And
wow.
Plato said a very similar thing to what I say about my theory that it's stories. Plato said we are God's toys, and he said that what we're doing here is we're playing.
Yeah. You're
This is
giving me
like,
the Matrix vibes right now. Like just
yeah,
unplugging from the
that's like
Matrix, plugging back
exactly,
in and making a deal with the robots to give you a good life when you go back in, or like that.
yeah.
Just it sounds,
And also that you might not want all good lives.
yeah.
If right, realizing before you go in that you're going to get out of it alive, you might paradoxically choose some terrible experiences to learn about them.
Yeah.
I was several times I've stood in the line with my daughter at a roller coaster, okay, sometimes for an hour
Hmm.
to get on a roller coaster with all these people around who want to get on a roller coaster, which I don't, right? But I'm standing with my daughter. And I looked at all these people and I said, well, these people full well know that when they're 90 miles an hour upside down, they're not going to want to be there, right? But they choose that experience with the foreknowledge that it has an end and it's
Hmm.
basically harmless.
Yes.
I think we might, I would choose kind of all kinds of unpleasant lives, knowing in
Oh, me
advance that
too.
I had 10,000s of them to live, because
Yeah.
just learning
Yeah.
experiences.
And
And
especially if
that
there's no
doesn't mean that when
consequences.
you're in the midst of it, you would be wanting it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Be
for
saying,
sure.
hey,
Wow. So if you had to conclude something based on all of your research over the years, it would point in that direction. I know that you said you don't really have any solid, or you don't want to say you have beliefs and stuff necessarily,
yeah,
but if you had to conclude your evidence, it points towards the idea that we are in some sort of story machine, whether it's created by
yeah,
ourselves or some other
yeah,
simulation or God or some
yeah.
all, design, someone who's designing it all. But there is nothing that points. So the conclusion is that it is possibly the story generator, but who or what is behind it is still a mystery, correct?
Yeah, well, I have in my latest book, After um, Making Sense of Nonsense, which has just been published, is called God is Bigger Than the Bible.
Oh,
And not being religious, I sort of came to God through hearing stories of people's near-death experiences. I'm still not religious,
hmm.
but I think, what I would say is, if somebody asks me, Raymond, do you believe that God exists? I say, no, absolutely not, because I, Raymond Moody, am a limited human being. Any belief that I could formulate about God would be bound to be mistaken in one
Hmm.
direction or another, right? Plus, if you think of that sentence, do you believe that God exists? The emphasis of the sentence is on the word exist. Now, maybe you had logic too, but you might remember, and I had in my logic courses I taught, I would teach the students about what the concept of existence is.
Hmm.
It takes about an hour, but you can go through it. You can explain what it means to say that something exists, and there's even a symbol for it, right? Remember
Hmm.
that backwards E, right?
Hmm.
Um, but what I say is that God is greater than existence. When somebody worries about whether God exists, what they're trying to do is they're trying to draw a circle around God with the human concept of
Hmm.
existence. But I say that it's the question of God's existence no more applies than the questions of God non-existence.
Hmm.
It's just using the wrong. It's that particular human distinction doesn't fit into it. God is greater than existence. A.J. Ayer in Language, Truth, and Logic says that by the principles of the logical positivism philosophy, he says that all sentences about God are nonsense. He said to say that God exists is nonsense. And then he quickly went on to say, and he said, and by that same token, it's just as nonsensical to say that God doesn't exist,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That it's like, is a railroad track male or female? See, it's just the question, the not the distinction doesn't apply.
Yes.
Where I go is, what I say is, I have a relationship with God. See, I don't think of it in terms of, I know a lot of people whose main activity in relation to God is trying to argue about or think about or reason about whether or not God exists. But I say that's I know all those arguments, like the argument from the design and the cosmological argument and the first cause argument and the ontological argument. But my point is, it's all of them are trying to use the concept of existence and relationship to God, whereas that we're dealing with a concept that's of a higher order than the concept of existence.
It's just
And so
outside
what
of
I
our
say
realm
is I
of
have a
understanding.
relationship with God. Like, well, what do I mean with that I have a relationship? Well, one thing is I did have a personal experience of the presence. You would call it a mystical experience or so on, but again, these things defy language. But another thing is, for example, this is one of my favorite examples. In 1990, I moved into an old grist mill, with the wheel on the outside that ground flour and from wheat or corn. And it had been built in 1839, and it had last been rewired in 1950. So I knew it needed rewiring, but at the time I didn't have the money. That was in May of 1990. 3 years and 4 months passed, and in September of 93, my wife said, well, we can get the money together now to get it rewired, but we didn't know an electrician. So we held hands by our kitchen sink, and we prayed that God would send us just the right electrician. The next morning, the phone rang. Cheryl picked up the phone and said, hello. Voice on the other end said, hello, this is B.R. Wilson. Cheryl said, yes, B.R., what is it? And he said, well, your number just came up on my beeper. And Cheryl said, well, we haven't made any phone calls this morning, B.R. What's this all about? And he said, well, I'm an electrician.
Whoa.
So Cheryl said, well, we do need an electrician. B.R., come on out. So shortly thereafter, he's out doing this inspection. He went around and he did his inspection, and then I went out and I sat down on the porch, and Cheryl escorted B.R. out to his van. And shortly thereafter, they were both back up on the porch, B.R. looking kind of shaken, and my wife, who's pale complexioned anyway, looking like the proverbial sheet. And so what had happened was that when Cheryl was putting B.R. in his van, he said, it's going to take a few days before I can get out here to do this, he said, because I come from a really close family around here. We all love each other very much. And my 38-year-old brother dropped dead of a heart attack the other day. And my mother had a heart attack on the way home from the funeral home. So Cheryl said, well, B.R., my husband might be able to help you with that. He talks with people who've been through grief and so on. And B.R. said, well, my mother gave me this book called Life After Life to read, and it's helping some. And that was the book that I had read. And that would be an example.
What? He was reading your book?
Yeah.
Whoa.
But I could give you a lot of these, Matt, but it's just, my point is that I think I can relate to God in terms of relationships. When it gets back to abstractions like existence, I give up.
Mm-hmm. So it's like these coincidences happen to a lot of people, but you're sitting there with the philosophical perspective that you come at it with, and your understanding of making sense of nonsense. These coincidences that happen that are just almost too coincidental, that make sometimes me question when things happen like that in my life. Like, I literally will say out loud, okay, we're in a simulation, like as a joke,
Yeah,
because it's
yeah,
so
exactly.
coincidental.
It's a natural.
But
It's a natural.
you're taking it as like these, that there could be, there are these patterns that could be something, that this could actually be a phenomenon happening that we just think as we chalk it up as coincidence, but really there could be something else going on.
Well, what I relate it back to story, right?
Mm.
Those 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 events of coincidences, they, do you think of them as physical events, or do you think of them as episodes in your story?
Wow, when you think of it long term, like in the bigger picture of things, it makes sense that it was like, it makes more sense of being a coincidence, like it was going to happen rather than it just being randomness.
It fits into a life story.
Yes, it does.
Mm.
Yes. Interesting. Wow, I think I understand a lot more now, the way that it makes more sense to think that there is something like afterwards, or this, it makes more sense the way that you apply it like that.
Yeah. Well, you know, listen, again, I just feel so bad about talking about my books because I'm not a salesman type, but um, get my book,
I will.
God Bigger Than the Bible, which
I'm gonna get them
just
both.
came out from Amazon. And it's only, you can get the Kindle, it's just a couple of dollars or something. If I had some books here, I don't have any copies of my own books right at this moment, but I would send them to you. But
Oh, it's
it's
okay.
like both of them are on Kindle.
Cool.
So I think you'd be interested in those. It's a whole different way of thinking about the afterlife and about these big issues that we're all interested in.
Yeah, yeah, it's so fascinating. And I appreciate the work that you do for this stuff, because there's not, I feel like without you leading some of the movement and starting some of the talk in the field of that stuff, and really just being brave and standing up for what you like feel in your heart needs to be talked about and looked at, I think is a very,
Well, thank you for that word brave, but that wasn't it.
no.
I just, I am not a brave person. I'm full of all kinds of fears. I'm afraid of driving a car, for example. I haven't driven a car in 25 years, but the things that people think of me as being brave are just comes from the fact that I can't overrule my curiosity.
Hmm.
I am just so curious about, like, for example, I worked in a unit for the criminally insane. It was a maximum security unit, mostly with paranoid schizophrenic killers who had done these terrible things, like you read about in the National Enquirer, or mass
Oh,
murderers, or serial killers. Mostly serial killers are sociopaths, so the judges will realize this doesn't count as insanity, which is unable to distinguish between right from wrong. They can, they just don't care, right? So most of the serial killers are sociopaths, but occasionally the really weird ones, like the Dahmer type and all, just really, really bizarre. We would get those too. So I was at any one time, we had 120 violent, psychotic people that I worked with all these incredible stories. I mean, I had one of my patients believed that he was a lion and had done these terrible things. I mean, it was every day. People, all my relatives and friends thought I was nuts for wanting to do this. And it's like, well, aren't you scared? Well, yes and no. I
but you're more
mean,
driven by curiosity than fear.
That's right. The curiosity overwhelms it. And we all
Wow.
kinds of understood that we were going to get assaulted.
Yeah.
I got assaulted twice. That just came with the territory.
Wow.
But the thing is, when I was a kid, Matt, I I remember in the seventh grade was when it got worse. I would sit in the seventh grade all day in my classroom. And in the morning, I would blast off from the earth and I would head out to Mars or Venus or wherever. And just all through the day, I would be going through the different stages of the voyage. And I would
Wow.
planned to get back on Earth about 3 o'clock when the bell went. And the whole time just hoping the teacher wouldn't call on me. Right? Well, then flash forward to the time when I was working in the maximum security unit. And I remember climbing up the hill one day to get to the entrance. And I thought, wow, here I am. I'm Raymond Moody, who used to sit all day in my grammar school class imagining flying out to different planets. And I said, today I can visit 15 different planets if I want to. It's just, the adventure. And so curiosity it really is what, so people say, oh, you were so brave to bring this out with Life After Life in 1975. Well, I wasn't brave at all. Number one, I just can't hold back my curiosity, and I was curious about these things. But even also on another track, by then I realized, the cardiopulmonary resuscitation was so common then, that whereas these things had always existed in the ancient world, they were very rare. But by the time I started investigating them, due to the widespread availability of cardiopulmonary resuscitation techniques, there were just lots and lots of people who had this. I used to lecture to civic clubs who, these civic clubs in these towns would hear about, and they have to have a speaker every Wednesday or whatever. While I was elected, and it was obvious, I never went to one. They typically had about 20 members. I never went to one where somebody didn't come up and say afterward, Dr. Moody, I've never told anybody this. So when that book was published, I full well realized that anybody who doubted me on it, that all they had to do was ask around, especially doctors, if they would just ask around among their own patients, they would see it for themselves.
Wow.
And that's exactly what happened. Within the first few weeks of Life After Life being published, I began to get these letters from physicians like, Dr. Moody, thanks so much for investigating this. I had a patient like this.
Wow.
So
it's like so common. Wow. And it's like something that's everyone's experiencing.
Yeah.
Fascinating. How fascinating that it was like a well-known thing that no one really talked about in the community.
Well, it wasn't, just because people to whom it happened were reluctant to talk about it.
And it's also because a lot of medical doctors too weren't philosophers. You approached the entire thing in a different order.
That's right.
You became a philosopher, then a medical doctor, and is there any doctor that becomes a philosopher? Who would ever become a philosopher after a doctor?
Medical doctors who also have a PhD in philosophy. I'm sure there are some of them, but I just haven't had the pleasure of meeting them.
You would think it would just be a little time consuming, and they wouldn't, necessarily be able to pursue that.
That's right. Because, medical education is, that's intense. Well, so is philosophical education. And unless you're just a person who's just, can't do anything other than think.
Yeah. Cursed with curiosity.
Yeah. Well, it's a wonderful thing.
It is.
It's been so.
I think a lot of the other interesting podcasts I've had, some of the most interesting ones I've had were with people with this curiosity bug inside of them that has taken them on a crazy direction in life. And I think that's a really important part of being a human that we can feed, and if it's fed right, it could really lead us to it develops the humanity in a crazy way.
I agree. I learned early in my psychiatry residency that everybody is chasing something. Or I guess most people that come to psychiatrists, all of them are chasing something. Some of them were chasing power, or some of them were chasing money, or some of them chasing fame, or some of them were chasing sex. And I was just so astonished by this in my first few months of residency that I went to my supervisor, John Buckman, and I said, John, it's amazing to me. All these people are so driven, like everybody's chasing something.
Yeah.
And I was kind of thinking, well, what's wrong with me? I'm just content with it. And John smiled and he said, now, Raymond, how old were you when you finished your second doctoral degree? And I said, I was 31. And before I could get it out of my mouth, I realized I'm chasing knowledge.
Yeah.
Right. So everybody's chasing something. And so, but I will say this, that what it's all about, as I learned from people with near-death experiences, is that what this is really about is learning to love. Right? That's what everybody says because of their life review. But then of the things you chase, my opinion at age 76 is that I am very satisfied with having spent a life in learning primarily about ancient Greek philosophy and the mind and logic. But the things that people know me for is near-death experiences. That's a corollary to me, but it's, it's utterly fascinating. But the background to me is the philosophy of language, which is how you think about things that don't make sense. And the amazing story of ancient Greek philosophy.
Yeah.
Matt, if you wrote the story of ancient Greek philosophy and submitted it to the National Enquirer, they would reject it because it would be too sensational that nobody would believe it.
Really?
But it absolutely happened.
Wow.
The Greek philosophy came, which, as you know, forms everything comes from.
Everything.
And it started with people who were out of their bodies, Hermotimus. There was in about 600 BC, there was this guy named Hermotimus who had developed the talent of being able to leave his body at will. So they got these early philosophers thinking about, there's two things, right? The body and this mind. And which one of those is the real one? That was part of it. And you think about the founder of logic was Parmenides, who articulated the notion of truth in a logical sense. But in his description of how he came about with this, it came from an oracle of the dead. He apparently was an evoker of the dead. And the way they would do it is they would lie stock still in a cave. And from their point of view, they would have a visionary voyage to the other side, right? So on one of these voyages, Parmenides got abducted by a goddess who sang him this song, which is the very first written out logical deduction. And she said, Parmenides, don't tell people to believe this because the goddess says so. Tell them to work it out in their own minds and see it for themselves. Wow. So when he would get his students to sing it till they learned it by heart. And it's when they did, they would have this epiphany where they would see the necessary connection of the premises with the conclusion, and which that would be the origin of the notion of truth, right? Because if it's true that Andy is taller than Bill, and true that Bill is taller than Charlie, then necessarily it follows that Andy is taller than Charlie. So, you mentioned Lucretius and the Epicureans. There were spiritual exercises that what these philosophers did. Even skeptics. I hate this way this word skeptic is bandied about. There's even an organization of people who call themselves the skeptics. And it's so irritating to me because they don't know what they're talking about. And this complicates my situation when I'm trying to teach ancient Greek philosophy. Because these so-called skeptics say, I'm a skeptic about these near-death experiences. I think it's just the chemistry of the brain. That's the thing you hear. Or I'm skeptic about apparitions of the deceased.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just wishful thinking. Well, that very kind of locution shows they don't have any idea what skepticism is. The skeptical philosophy originated about 20 years after Aristotle in the Hellenistic period. And the context of it was that Aristotle had formulated the logic that we still use. Okay? And if you think about logic, it's a device for generating conclusions from premises, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what Pyrrho, Pyrrho, was the skeptic. And his thought was, well, we know how to do this. We're good at logic, learn this system, but what would happen if we don't draw the conclusion? See, it was like, what if you really bear down, you ask every question, you really think it through, but then in the end, you refrain from drawing the conclusion. And so the reason they did this was two things. Number one, it's a mind-bending experience. It really does. I've sort of practiced it intuitively all my life, and you do it because it just does the most amazing things to your brain or to your mind. Hume sort of talked about that. But also, if you think about it geometrically, and everybody else is running in the same direction to get to the conclusion, but your procedure is to avoid a conclusion, then that opens up your peripheral vision, right?
Mm-hmm.
You see side pathways of inquiry that everybody else missed because they're oriented toward the conclusion.
Wow.
So now, knowing that, read back to yourself what the organized skeptics like this psychops organization does. I'm a skeptic about these near-death experiences. I think it's just the chemistry of the brain. What that person is saying is, I'm a person who doesn't draw conclusions, and my conclusion is such and such.
Yeah, it becomes a religion in a sense where
it is.
Yes.
And the specific religion it is called humanism.
Yeah, to truly practice skepticism, you'd have to combine it with agnosticism too, and approach it with almost not set on any beliefs or
That's right.
desiring any outcome.
Yeah, where I am with the afterlife, I can't draw a conclusion, so I don't draw a conclusion.
Yeah.
And yet, I've sort of boxed myself into a corner, but where it's not as a logical conclusion, but more just as an exclamation almost, that I have to say that I gather there's an afterlife. It's not a conclusion. To me, it sort of came about from a number of things. One is, for example, medical doctor friends of mine who tell me that during they're trying to resuscitate patients, that they themselves empathically enter into this state of consciousness, and they sort of empathically co-live the near-death experience of their patient.
Wow.
That they're out of their body along with the patient, it's Jeff Olson, who's a graphic artist. Some years ago had this horrible car crash where his leg was smashed off, and his wife died instantly, and one of his kids, I believe, was killed, and the other kid lived. And so he had a very profound near-death experience. And then in talking with the Jeff O'Driscoll, the eminent emergency room physician who was there at the hospital when it happened, that Jeff O'Driscoll acknowledges that while Jeff Olson was being saved by the surgeons and having his near-death experience, that Simultaneously, Jeff O'Driscoll was talking with Jeff Olson's dead wife in the emergency room. And then as the sort of developed, then the nurse spoke up and said, yeah, well, me too. And, at a certain point, I don't know what else to say. I have at least a dozen medical doctor friends who had these near-death experiences.
Wow.
And who assure me, yeah, this was real. Now I put myself into this position. I'm an inveterate walker. I have to exercise every day. It's not a virtue, it's an addiction.
Mm-hmm.
So I imagine, and I hate even to say this, but I'm trying to imagine the horror. What if I hurt my foot? Would I go to Dr. Anthony Ciccori, who's a professor of orthopedic surgery at NYU, who also has a PhD in physiology and is a very nice man? And I say, well, also that Anthony Ciccori had an event in 1996, I think it was, when it was struck in the neck by a bolt of lightning, which went out his ankle, and he had a cardiac arrest.
Mm.
And he was at a family reunion, and from his point of view, he was going around the family reunion, observing that other people in the family who didn't know that he, was struck by lightning at another part of this place. And
so he was walking around. So he was at a family reunion, walked outside, got struck by lightning, and then was back inside. He went back inside.
Well, what happened is that when people are out of their body, they may say they go to different places and they can see that things were going on. So he was able to see what his relatives were doing at the reunion before they realized. From his point of view, he was out of his body.
Whoa.
Well, then Tony, who had never had any interest whatsoever in the piano, suddenly developed this interest in the piano and started having a recurrent dream in which he was playing the same piece on a concert stage on the piano. So he learned how to transcribe music and transcribe this piece and started taking piano lessons. And now, in addition to being an eminent orthopedic surgeon, he's a concert pianist. And so, I mean, I could give you a dozen other stories like this, but my point is, my medical friends who've had these experiences are unanimous in their statement that what they experienced was real. Now, how can I reconcile my complete trust in their medical judgment? If, heaven forbid, something happened to my foot, would I go to Tony for absolutely yes? Mm-hmm. You see what I mean? It creates this kind of schism in your, and also it's like I think of specific events in the history of science, for example. Aristotle said, in reports of meteorites, Aristotle said that these stories were just false, because he said stones can't fall from heaven because there's no stones in heaven to fall. Okay, now this was, orthodoxy for a long time. In the early 19th century, there was a big meteorite fall in New Haven, I think, and two professors from Yale went out and picked up the pieces and wrote a report on it for a scientific journal. And this part I've read in the government report, so I'm assuming it's true, but I would want to know more about the context. But allegedly it says in the government report that, that Thomas Jefferson was an eminent man of science too in that era. And so they apparently sent him the article to referee. And so Jefferson's reply was, gentlemen, I had rather believed that those two Yankee professors would lie than believe that stones fell from heaven. See, and so then a few years later, there was a big scene in France where a meteorite fall killed a bunch of cows. And finally, people had to say, well, okay. But my point here is, see, you can't get pig-headed about these things. There's plenty of stuff left in the world to have adventures for and learn about. And I've just always been so fascinated, Matt, with people I know who there's a certain kind of attitude that people have that, well, when I finish my doctoral degree or my PhD, then knowledge stops. I've known a lot of people like that, that they just can't get over this fact that the process of knowledge is cumulative and goes on. And they want it to stick, where the textbook said at their time. And so I feel sorry for people like that.
Yeah.
Because to me, the adventure is learning new stuff.
It is. And the journey along the way that makes it all worth it as well.
A surgeon in Italy one time told me that he was had this patient. He was a relatively young, I guess, middle-aged man who was in there for just a very minor elective procedure. And so there was no thought that anything bad would happen. So in the surgery, the young man had a cardiac arrest on the table, and to his astonishment, he was just beside himself. Like, how did this happen? Also, he was unsuccessful in the resuscitation. And he was saying, oh my God, what am I going to tell the patient's family? And how did this happen? Whereupon he said the operating room door burst open and a woman came screaming in that he first assumed to be a psychiatric patient who had escaped or something. And you know how when you're really stressed, you can't make sense of what somebody's saying anyway when you're And he said he had to focus on this woman's face to say, what are you saying? And he realized she was saying, my husband is not dead. She said, I was out in the waiting area and my husband came to me and he said, you think he's dead and that I need to come in here to tell you that he's not dead.
Whoa.
So the surgeon said he doesn't even remember resuming the resuscitation. He just went on automatic. But sure enough, after a while, this guy came out back, and he said he was in the recovery room for a while, and he was there when the patient regained consciousness. And he said the first thing the patient said to him was, I was out of my body up there looking at you, and I could tell you thought I was dead, but I kept trying to tell you I'm not dead, but you wouldn't hear me. So I went out into the waiting area and I tried to tell my wife to come in here and tell you I'm not dead.
Whoa.
Yeah.
And she reported
at the same time.
Whoa.
At the same time, man, these are startling and engaging stories, but fact is that we're not set up yet to figure out what this means. I mean, it's, and that's why I'm saying I want to go back to I think I've worked this problem out, is how you think about this in a way that you can investigate it in a genuinely rational way.
Yeah.
One of the things that just makes me so sad about people is I've known a lot of people who, what they want to do, they have something out here that they think they believe this or think they do. And their reasoning process consists of trying to build some sort of bridge of reasons, no matter how flimsy, to prop that thing they already believe on.
Yeah.
And that must be I try to imagine what that would feel like inside. I think it must be miserable.
Mm-hmm. It's like a house of cards.
Yeah. And to me, what I want to know is what is. And the best way of finding that is to learn the rules of reasoning assiduously, to be your own worst critic, to bear down on every single thing that you say or think, and try to think of all the objections.
Hmm.
and then try to put it together in a situation where, put it down in such a way that other people can read it, and then kind of hope, almost paradoxically, that they can come up with some objections.
Yeah.
Like what I say in my new book, for example, Making Sense of Nonsense. The way I'm putting this out here is I'm saying, look, this is a breakthrough in the genuine rational investigation of life after death. And not asking you to believe that. What I'm asking you to do is to try to find a flaw in it,
Mm-hmm.
to read this through and to be very, very critical. Because if you find some mistake in my reasoning, then I'm benefited, because then I see where I've gone.
Yeah.
If, on the other hand, you can't find any flaws in my reasoning, then that gives me some kind of support for thinking I'm on the right track.
It does, which is why I think you got this successful with it too.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
also I will say, some years ago, I gave this to the 14 of the most brilliant people I know, none of whom had any interest in the afterlife. These were, like, one of them was an astronomer, professors of logic, professor of business, professor of psychology, a sociologist, just a lot of different scholars who I knew to be really good thinkers. And I said, you just be very severe for this and try to find any errors in this,
Yeah.
because I'm about to put this out and saying this is a breakthrough on the afterlife. So I don't want to be wrong. I mean, so the best way for me to guarantee it is to please find flaws in it.
Yeah.
They found typos, but nobody found any any logical flaw in the work.
Yeah.
So that gives me some kind of expectation that I think that this is going to work. It won't go over well with what I call the afterlife establishment, because Plato's work, the Phaedo, in my opinion, I read it when I was 18, and I've studied the whole gamut of views about the afterlife and so on. In my opinion, nobody has ever gotten better than Plato's Phaedo on the rational side of this. Like, that's the closest anybody has ever done to coming up with a genuinely rational analysis of the afterlife question. And he points out 12 major factors, by my count, that are going to enter into any rational investigation of the afterlife. And one of the first ones, and I think this is one of the most critical ones, it's called I call it the narrative concept problem. And what Plato says at the very beginning, he says, look, in order to start discussion of the afterlife started on a rational basis, you've got to have some sort of storyline or narrative, right? Because, he says, the notion itself is so obscure, if not self-contradictory, right, that you've got to have some sort of story just to get it started. And they had the same kind of stories we did, like apparitions and near-death experiences and all, plus actually one that we don't have anymore in the same form. But he said, even if you had a million stories, that's not going to add up to a proof of an afterlife. He said, what you have to have is some set of concepts that enable you to connect the narratives to the sentence, there is life after death. And he was stuck at that point. He tried two things, the Pythagorean theory of opposites and his own theory of ideas, and was acknowledged that that wasn't enough.
Wow.
Well, then you come to Aristotle, and Aristotle has logic. And so maybe you think, well, this is an inside track. But as Hume pointed out, no, the mind we have and the logic we have is not adequate for solving this problem. And then A.J. Ayer went on with the logical positivists in the early 20th century, and he said things like, we can say, our language permits us to say that a man survived a total long change of personality, or total loss of memory, but our language doesn't permit us to say that, but that it's a self-contradiction to say that a man survives the annihilation of his body.
Mhm.
See?
Yeah.
So unintelligibility is the problem.
Yeah.
So what I say is I've solved that, because now I can show how to think logically about things that are unintelligible. And when you put all this together, then you can apply that to the near-death experience and give people a whole new way of articulating this. And then once we get these different articulations, that's like gives us a class of comparison.
Hmm.
And I
So,
think this is going to work. I do.
now, are there things that we can do to, besides prepare ourselves, but prepare maybe like the situation or the room for testing some experiments? Like if people are reporting out of body experiences, can't we maybe if
Put
I
something on a shelf up above.
exactly, or
Yeah,
outside of the
well, I'm
room?
dubious about this, and
Has
I'll
that
tell
actually
you.
been proven?
Some people have tried to do it, but I've never taken this serious. This is a classical parapsychological experiment,
Mm.
and it's based on a fallacious premise. And what it has to do with is, in parapsychology, I guess their chief thing is in investigating mediums and also in investigating these perceptions of people out of their bodies, has to do with the assumption that they say that the medium, for example, told me things about my Uncle Willis that she couldn't possibly have known.
Hmm.
Or the people doing these cockamamie experiments with the shelf, they say, well, if that person got out of their body and they were accurately able to say that what was on the shelf, that was something they couldn't possibly have known. Well, that's just, that is, and number one, notice that wasn't proven afterlife, would it? I mean,
No,
the fact that while
that would just
something
prove
was
that the
still,
consciousness leaves.
somebody was out of their body, they could report that something was on the shelf.
Yeah.
That wouldn't prove anything about a transcendent state of existence
No.
as we imagine the afterlife. Okay. Plus, when I was a resident, I really enjoyed emergency room psychiatry.
Hmm.
You're on call. When you're on call for psychiatry, you are on call for the emergency room. And this was one of my favorite things to do. And I would sit there when patients came into the psychiatric ER. I would sit there for hours just talking to these people because, number one, it's so much fun, right? Plus, these are people, you need to help them. So I would take very thorough notes. Matter of fact, the guy who was the director of the psychiatric ER was a very compulsive man. And years later, it got back to me that when I was on call, he was so relieved because he knew I was so thorough in all these write-ups. So this one night, I went down there at 11 o'clock and I checked our input box, and we had 11 patients in the ER. And so my normal way of doing this is out the window. You just, the luck of the draw. Some nights nobody comes in, some like lots of people. This was 11 people when I got there. So I couldn't do my normal thing of just sitting there and listening to the whole story come out as it would. So first patients, a couple in their 50s, and you could tell they were just worried to death. Well, what's their problem? And what's your problem? Our 30-year-old son, we brought him in. We're just so worried about him. Well, what is it? He hasn't slept for nights. He's noisy all night. He works and sweeps the floor all night. So I said, well, 30 years old, has he had a psychotic breakdown before? No, nothing like this has ever happened. Well, That's late for schizophrenia, right? Schizophrenia usually comes on in the 20s.
Mm-hmm.
So, plus he's in this hyperactive. So I said, well, look, has he been making lots of long distance phone calls? Yeah. Well, what about spending a lot of money, man? Yeah. Well, what about hypersexuality? Oh, his girlfriend is. Well, what about jewelry? Has he started making wearing a lot of jewelry? Yeah. Well, what about a big hat? Is he wearing a big hat? Yeah. And I remember at that point looking into that woman's eyes. See, from her point of view, I was saying things about her son that I couldn't possibly have known.
Mm-hmm.
See, so we're not set up to compute and think about what somebody else couldn't possibly have known about us.
Mm.
When you go to the dermatologist, you go to the dermatologist because you know that he knows about the skin, or go
Yeah.
to the neurologist, you go because he knows about the nerves. The only people you go to because of things they couldn't possibly have known about you were psychics and mediums.
Mm-hmm.
And what does it mean to say that he knew things he couldn't possibly have known? Isn't that a self-contradiction?
Yeah.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
So my point of view is that these psychological experiments, they're nowhere, this won't get you any closer to knowing about life after death.
Mm.
You've got to send people over there with some new way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
And then to see how that affects what they tell you when they come back.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get it now.
And at the same time, I got to say, Matt, that's impressive. I mean, I've been in resuscitation situations myself where it gives you a really uncanny feeling that this patient was able to describe details of the resuscitation that they shouldn't have been able to describe. But you know, but the notion of things they couldn't possibly have known, that's not going to get me anywhere because that's not a coherent notion.
Are you looking forward to life after life?
You mean yeah,
When you
I
pass on,
am.
are you looking like, are
Oh
you
yeah,
nervous
yeah.
about it? Or are
This
you
is a
looking
very
forward?
yeah. I one thing I can say is I'm not scared of death. It's life that scares me.
Hmm.
And the nice thing about being this age is that I am ready to go. And at the same time, I realize why I'm here. That is that I have a 22-year-old and a 20-year-old
Hmm.
who are still at home. And I just feel like I want to stay around for them a little longer to get them on the road.
Hmm.
It's so, you know, it really, you'll see yourself when you reach this age.
Hmm.
It's like, you know, that old song about the happiest life is a life to service to others.
Yeah.
Well, when you're a kid, you hear that as an ideal,
Mm-hmm.
right? Then maybe for some people anyway, it becomes an aspiration. But then when you reach a certain age, it just becomes a fact of experience.
Hmm.
Because whenever you're focused on yourself, you're miserable. But what really makes you happy is to focus on doing things for other people. That is really happiness.
Oh.
And so that's where I am now. And just quite honestly, I do kind of want to head on because I did geriatric psychiatry for a year. I know how the events happen. I don't want to be getting into the fall, you know, and the surrounded by the tubes and wires. I just
Yeah.
don't want that.
Yeah.
So if
Same.
you ask me, just for me, yeah, I'm kind of ready to go on.
Yeah.
And at the same time, the duty side of it comes up
Yeah.
that I
Like you still
want
got a
to.
job left here.
I still got these kids I need to. And my wife, she's very strong, and she, you know, I mean, for her too. But I want to
Yeah.
It's our both of our primary focus is on the kids. So
That's awesome.
that's where I'm on in life, and I still, since we lived here in Sarasota since September, and because of the change, and I put my books on new shelves and all, and I've just been piling them up. The other day I counted, and it's up now. Since September, I've read 42 academic books.
Wow.
And I think back to when I was in my 20s, I loved reading books, but at the same time, it was a kind of chore. It was something that took a certain kind of effort. But now here at 76, I can just take a book and like zap, you like just suck it in. And what I see is that's because there's so much stuff in there already. See that whatever new you read that fits into the stuff you've seen before.
Yeah.
So it's very gratifying. And I will say, like I said earlier, that I've seen the most gratifying kind of life live for somebody like me is that process of knowledge, because the older you get, the more you appreciate it. Whether I've never met anybody in my psychiatric practice who was sought power, for example, who was happy, or who sought money, who was happy.
Yeah. Now,
Or fame. But I will say that just like Plato and Socrates said, that the life of examination and trying to learn, that's very satisfying.
yeah. So when you pass on, do you grieve for loved ones who pass on, or do you want loved ones grieving over you? Like, how do you tell someone who is grieving over losing someone? Like,
Well, grief is something that you can't, it's not a matter of decision. It's a process that's going to take place. And yes, yeah, I do. I do grieve. And this is a common thing I've heard from people with near-death experiences say that paradoxically, it makes their grief even more acute. Because, if you use the notion of an afterlife as a rationalization, you say, oh, I'm not going to grieve. I'm not going to feel bad about grandma because I know from my religion that she's in a beautiful place. That's self-deception, right?
mm-hmm.
Or rationalization.
Yeah.
But what people with near-death experiences say, yeah, sure, I know grandma's in a great place, but I miss her. See, so it's I still miss my grandmother who died, and so yes, I still have the grieving things, and I kind of, part of my prayer every day is that that when I do die, that God guides my kids through a grieving process that will benefit them in the whole context of their lives and comfort them.
That's a beautiful way to look at it. What a fascinating interview this has been. I know I've kept you over a little bit longer than we've talked, but I couldn't express how much I appreciate this. Like, this has been one of the fascinating conversations I've ever had with somebody. And I really just appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day and schedule.
I am so happy to do it. When I heard you were a student, I immediately wanted to do it because what are you studying?
Broadcasting, and I minored in psychology a little bit, but I've taken philosophy courses and everything like that. So it's
terrific.
A huge interest for me.
Yeah, you'll never regret it. I've never met anybody who regrets having been a philosophy major.
That's actually good to know.
Yeah, it is. Because what happens is when you're about 50, it's automatic. I had a friend who was MD and a board certified cardiologist and a major general in the Air Force, and a PhD in organic chemistry. And I was with him when he was about 50, and we were talking about our background, and I said, yeah, I studied philosophy. And he said, he kind of, he said, I wish so much I'd studied philosophy. Just when people are about 50 is when it usually occurs. It's when it naturally, by the life development, people begin to think about these big questions.
Interesting. Yeah, and some people just get those questions a lot earlier in life and pursue it.
Yeah. And again, I want to ask you if you could possibly, they're on Kindle, if you could take a look at
I will most
God
definitely.
is Bigger Than the Bible and Making Sense of Nonsense, and let me know what you think. I'm really interested because I've obviously had you just a really smart guy.
Thank you.
So this is it's nice to talk to you about this stuff.
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoy this, and I will definitely read those books. I've been looking for a new book to dive into, so I'm going to get into those ones, especially that Making Sense of Nonsense. Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Yes, that one sounds super, super interesting too, because of the just everything we were talking about with the almost just having it as a new language or a new way of learning what nonsense is. I think that one's going to really speak to me as well. But I will definitely give both of them a read.
Very strong reactions from my students about that.
Really?
Yeah, that it opens up parts of their minds they don't know they have.
Yeah, it's probably striking those chords that you don't really work out too much. Is there any plugins or anything that you would like to tell the audience? Any places they could find you or get your books or anything like that?
Well, the website is lifeafterlife.com, and there's a lot of stuff on there about my work, and again, not to try to sell books, but anybody who might be interested in God is Bigger Than the Bible and Making Sense of Nonsense, I would greatly appreciate your comments, because I'm trying to get, what I'm doing is I'm conducting a collective study of the afterlife where people reformat their minds in advance so that when subsequently they have a near-death experience, they'll be able to talk about it in a new way. So just by reading the book and working the exercises in it, then you in effect join the study.
That is awesome.
I think we can make a collective step across the frontier between this life and the next life by doing this.
Heck yeah. I love that way of approaching it. You're giving people the tools, like you're training our brains to learn how to prepare for it in case it happens to us, so we can come back with intel for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that is awesome. All right. So everybody who is listening, please go read their book, go read his book, go to the website and, give him the support, comment if you have any experiences, or, if you've experienced a near-death experience or know somebody who has, get in touch with you, correct? Is that something that? Yeah.
You can get through the information on how to get me is there on the website.
Awesome. I appreciate this a lot, Dr. Moody.
I do too. This has just been the greatest thing, man.
Thank you. It was really, really great talking to you.
Likewise.
Well, everybody who's listening, I appreciate tuning in this episode. If you enjoyed it, please go and follow Dr. Moody on social media, go on his website and give him support, and check out his books. They seem very interesting, and I will be giving them a look myself for sure.
Yeah, and I want to thank all the people who are listening in too for this. It's been just so much fun to do this.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I appreciate it. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, hit that thumbs up or like button, or even share this podcast with some friends. And make sure you subscribe to my channel on all listening platforms to stay up to date with all the new content coming out. That's the Matt Rich Podcast on all listening platforms. If you'd like to support the channel, visit my Patreon at patreon.com/the Matt Rich Podcast. I love you all, and I will see you next time.